screen. All right, hopefully folks are seeing that slide. And I'll go ahead and launch in. So as Becky said, this is the third of our 4 webinar sessions. And this one is focusing on measuring visitor use and attendance. We had one that Ashley led on big data. We talked last week about using visitor surveys as a tool in visitor use management. And today we're going to hit on just some key topics related to measuring visitor use and attendance. We should have time at the end for questions and discussion because we'll only be able to scratch the surface here, and maybe this will lead to some further conversations down the road. As Becky mentioned, this topic came up a lot when we were talking with various park managers, and then in our survey that we did, we heard that there's a lot of concern about how attendance data are collected. They're required across the state and state parks, but there's some concern about the accuracy of the data and how they're collected and then how they're used. So we're going to hit on a few key highlights here today. We'll talk very briefly about why are we collecting these data, what do we use them for, a little bit about approaches that can be used. So we're going to give some examples that are kind of interesting for thinking about what might work well in your area with your conditions, and then we'll have that time for discussion at the end. So why are we focusing on this? Why do we collect these data? There's a number of uses that attendance data can be put to. At a broader scale, establishing system-wide priorities, thinking about long-term planning, what resources need to be provided. I'm going to talk about the Forest Service's national effort towards the end of this presentation, and that's explicitly around this system-wide priorities, thinking across the entire national forest system and how recreation manifests in different locations. At a more local scale, the data can be very useful for resource allocation, particularly for thinking about staffing and funding visitor services that might be directly related to visitation. And then also in this visitor use management scenario for establishing capacity of areas, we have talked to a number of parks that have done this, also for minimizing impacts to resources. And the graph that I've got here is showing visitation to Three Sisters Wilderness up here in Oregon, where the Forest Service has maybe 2-3 years ago implemented a broad-scale mandatory permit system for day use and overnight use in several of the high-use wildernesses, and the data are fairly dramatic. You can see this incredible rise in use that happened after about 2010, and these data were used to help establish the need for the permit system, which was rather controversial, and so therefore the data were quite useful for establishing that need. We can also use the data for calibrating and helping to interpret other measures. We talked about some examples previously in webinars. Ashley talked about the utility of attendance data when using other sources of data like mobile device data. And then I talked a little bit about how the data can be used to help you establish the representativeness of visitor surveys if you're going to be gathering that type of data. So multiple purposes that attendance data can be used for. I did want to say, though, that it's not always necessary to have attendance and visitation data to take management actions. Sometimes it's very plausible to convincingly establish that there's a problem. And a couple of examples of this we heard from folks across the state parks of essentially where visitor use was at such a level that's causing safety issues, capacity related issues. One was Fern Canyon and Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park, where access is quite limited along a narrow road. The area is extremely popular. Parking along the shoulders was impeding emergency access. Lots of search and rescue and safety concerns, just clearly a problem that was manifest without the need for accurate use data. And then similarly, McCarthy Burney Falls, when we talk to managers there, you've got a situation with traffic parking, quarter mile down the highway, blocking through traffic, safety issues and concerns. Again, accurate data are not needed to address these problems. They're clearly problems. Sometimes on the resource side too, it's possible to establish that there are needs for management without having accurate attendance data. In some cases, it's resource impacts caused by either visitor trampling, social trails, parking. In the case of the Willamette National Forest, their rangers were documenting the amount of trash that they were carrying out of these wildernesses every year, which was a very compelling statistic in the conversations around their limited entry system. And they didn't need attendance data to do that. They simply could just document how much trash they were generating. So often attendance data are very important, and we'll talk about those examples today, but just wanted to point out that's not always necessary. So how do you collect attendance data if you choose to go down that road? We're going to briefly review the primary options that are available: reservations and fees, trail and vehicle counters, observational-based counts, and then I put big data up here because it's clearly an important and probably increasingly important tool, although I won't talk about it further in this webinar since we had a complete webinar dedicated to that method. I want to reiterate, though, that some of these kinds of data do require calibration or validation. In the case of counters, calibration for sure. In the case of counts, sometimes it's validation and establishing the reliability, which I'll talk about a little bit more. I'm not going to say too much about using reservations and fees because they're pretty straightforward. They have the advantage that they can generate very accurate data, and that data can be useful for correlational analysis. And you're going to see a really nice example of this later on from Torrey Pines. However, often you're only capturing a portion of the user base. As you all are pretty aware, many parks have unpaid visitation. And if you're using reservations, the issue of the no-show rate is critical because we know that lots of folks make reservations and don't use them. And so trying to estimate total use based on reservations alone rather than a check-in rate or something like that would be problematic. Vehicle and trail counters are extremely useful for collecting certain kinds of attendance data. They have the advantage of being available to collect data 24/7 without the need for staff on site all of that time. They are coming down in cost considerably, and they can be quite accurate. So we have used them a lot in various projects. And if you have questions about specific models and things, we can address those towards the end. You do need to think about where they work. They don't work in all locations. They work the best where vehicles or people enter through a pinch point, because typically they're either measuring something that passes over a coil or something that breaks a beam. So in a large dispersed area, they just don't work well. So think open beaches, not going to be super useful. They count anything that passes the beam, or if it's axles, any axle that passes over. And so that can be vegetation, it can be wildlife, it can be people going in and out on a trail. And so the counts don't correspond. You cannot assume that the counts correspond one-on-one to visitation. That's why that calibration is so critical for using these. But again, often when they're placed well, they're very accurate. They give really good estimates of total visitation. You do need to think about vandalism. We had one of our big base encounters was removed from its post 3 times during the season. And typically you hear stories of, people see them, they might mess with them a little bit. I wanted to say something. I'm not going to say a lot here, and maybe it's a point we can come back into in discussion about using cameras for estimating visitation. 10 years ago, this wasn't really a viable option so much. Sometimes folks would use wildlife cameras along trails, particularly in remote areas. But the issue was the image processing, that looking through image after image can be very time consuming. But with rapid increases in AI and automatic image recognition, I think this approach is going to be more and more viable for some areas. So again, I'm not going to say more about cameras, but if there are questions towards the end, we can come back to that. Sometimes it's useful to do observation-based counts, basically having a person on site counting either from a stationary location or roaming. And counts can take multiple forms. They can be counting entries, people or vehicles at one time, encounters among groups along a trail, and those different types of data are going to serve different purposes. Counting entries is a good way to get total attendance. You know how many cars or people or both come into a site over some period of time. Counting people or vehicles at one time is a great way to assess capacity of parking lots or viewpoints or other congregation places. Those two things aren't necessarily interchangeable. Entries can't tell you about capacity on their own because you need to know how long folks stay, what your turnover rate is. Capacity utilization can't tell you about your total attendance. So you need to be thinking about why you're using the data and get the appropriate kind. Monitoring encounters along trails, so the experience that visitors have, is the best way to track the visitor experience. Total counts is not a good proxy for what kind of experience people are having on a particular trail. They're just poorly correlated. So sometimes if this is important, that's the kind of data that you would want to collect. Some considerations. Where do these kinds of counts work? Well, they're time consuming, right? Resource intensive. And so more easily accessed locations, if you've got a location that's already staffed, that can be useful. One interesting example, some colleagues with the Forest Service in Wyoming, over a period of years, they were on their drive back and forth from duty stations. They were driving past, I don't know if it was ski parking lots accessing ski parks or trailheads, but they basically would make counts every time they passed by. And so it's a bit hazard in terms of the time of day and the day of the week and so on. But over a period of years, they actually amassed a lot of data just simply on this ad hoc basis. And that was adequate for their needs to really understand kind of what their use patterns were. You need to think about the cost and effort at low use places. If your folks are largely sitting around counting nobody who's there, people who are not there, documenting that no one is present, it may not be worth that kind of effort. So thinking about, what's the bang for the buck there. Also, reliability can be an issue. If you imagine that you're walking down this beach in this picture trying to count the number of people present, how accurate are you going to be? If two people were doing counts at the same time, how close to each other would their estimates be? Sometimes it's useful to collect that information on reliability. For a project we did at Golden Gate, it was really important that we established the reliability of our measures. It was a fairly controversial management setting, and so having really strong data was important, so that we spent more effort into establishing the reliability of measures there. I did want to point out this last bullet, what level of resolution is needed. I think about parking lots often in this respect. If you're thinking about capacity issues, do you really need to know exactly how many cars are present, or is what's important whether the parking lot is 80% full, 50% full, 25% full? You can imagine making those qualitative estimates about capacity is much quicker than walking through a parking lot counting all the vehicles present. And if your issue is you're trying to tweak a reservation system, knowing that a parking lot is 80% full is probably quite, that is probably adequate for your needs there. Or if it's 25% full, you probably have capacity for more. So thinking about that in advance can help you design efficiently. Turning now to sampling, we talked quite a bit about the value of random sampling and challenges and uses of convenient sampling during last week's webinar. And we also talked a little bit about amount of data needed, and those both apply to some forms of attendance estimation. So I'm not going to talk as much about those this week, but we'll have a few things to say here. One is that sampling isn't an issue when you're using fees or counters, because essentially they're a census. They count everything that's present. And so, thinking about sampling is just not pertinent. However, for those observational methods, you do need to think about how much data you're going to collect, how representative your data are or should be, and then any additional data that you might want to collect. The amount of data does depend on how you might want to stratify. Do you want to break it out by beach use versus natural area use, like we'll talk about in the Torrey Pines example, or you just need an overall total estimate. The representativeness of the data is something that I think we were hearing a fair bit of conversation about with managers, that those required estimates of daily use that y'all have to report, folks were recognizing that sometimes they're made by somebody who's present at some point in time, making some kind of count and then making some sort of estimate to extrapolate to the overall day. And we heard concerns about whether those data were actually representative of what actual use levels are. So that seems like a point that system-wide there are conversations happening about. Just a note on the ancillary data, sometimes you might need things like the turnover rate, length of stay. At Big Basin this summer, we paired our counts in the parking lot with a tire chalking protocol so that we could determine how long vehicles were present. And that was really useful for thinking about how the parking reservation system might be tweaked in the future. A few things that you can do to think about being highly efficient. One is you might consider focusing on peak times. If you understand your system well, this can be a very useful, say, canary in a coal mine type of approach. So for example, if you know your busiest time is early afternoon, and you know what your most popular parking lot is, if you're present documenting use during those early afternoon periods, and you find that the parking lot's not very full, you probably are fairly confident that the rest of your system is not experiencing high levels of use. And so this is a really efficient way to overall validate that you don't have capacity concerns. And this is the approach we're recommending for Big Basin for next year, is that they collect data between that noon and 2 p.m. time slot in their main parking lots and not focus on collecting additional data elsewhere, because those parking lots really are the pinch point for folks coming into the system. Considering a pilot effort, I talked about this some last time, starting small, looking at what the data tell you, and then deciding whether you need to scale up or use a more rigorous approach in subsequent years. If you do end up collecting data at haphazard or convenience times, being careful to document the dates and times so that you can provide narrative commentary on how representative you think the data are. All right, let's turn now to a handful of examples. We have a few from California and then a couple of other ones that I thought might be just interesting to talk about today. In each of these examples, we'll talk about what the issue was, why we were focusing, or you were focusing on attendance data, what types of data either have been collected or potentially could be collected in the future. We have some thoughts and suggestions in a couple of cases, and an overall kind of approach that has been used or might be used. And I do want to point out, we're talking about a couple of examples that we heard about from some of you all in conversations this fall. And any mistakes in how we portray the details of those cases are errors in what we heard, not the actual folks on the ground. So I want to be sure to acknowledge that. And if I do say something wrong and folks are on the call, you can certainly chime in during the discussion and set the record straight. So the first example is Fern Canyon. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, where the visitor use levels were causing the safety concerns related to parking and search and rescue, but also concerns about resource impacts. And so it was fairly clear that what was going on here was towards a reservation system, which has been piloted now. And so that the kind of data that was needed were related to attendance and capacity, parking capacity, total use. It is a relatively simple system insofar as everyone enters on one road past one entrance kiosk. And so that makes it more manageable than, say, some open beach where people can enter from neighborhoods and so on. And so the system that was put into place for reservations resulted in really significant decrease in search and rescue and injuries from what we heard. And so that seems like it's been fairly successful that way. They are thinking about no-show rates and parking lot capacity. And so moving forward, information on the turnover rate, like the stay, could help refine the reservation system to allow more access if that's deemed desirable. And that could be collected either with volunteers or potentially with a survey. The kiosk is 4 miles from the main parking area, so it's difficult for kiosk staff to collect that kind of data, but it's possible that a small effort could help inform that. Another ongoing example of challenges with estimation that we heard about from a few folks, and I think is pretty widespread in California, are the state beaches where there's a lot of unpaid visitor access. You can see in this photo that the beach, of course, is right next to these neighborhoods. Folks come from city streets or from county lands. And so, there's really no easy way to capture them, yet reporting attendance data is required. So in talking with folks, some people have been exploring the idea of mobile device data. And again, if you didn't see the webinar that Ashley led, that could be a useful starting point for thinking about some of these other sources of data. It could be problematic if people are leaving devices in their cars or just the resolution on some of those data. These are situations generally where trail counters are not effective for estimating overall visitation, although they might be able to be paired with some other kinds of efforts to impute total visitation. So really challenging. This is probably the most challenging kind of setting that we encountered in terms of estimating overall beach use. So in talking with folks, we're exploring the possibility of using people on human observers to walk beaches and count the number of people present at one time. We have a protocol for that. We developed at Golden Gate. That seemed pretty effective for counting people at one time. But you do need a way to turn that into total attendance. And so we've just been throwing around the idea of possibly using cameras maybe on lifeguard stations to take instantaneous images that could be counted for total people present and see if there's some, what kinds of correlations might emerge, or doing these people at one time counts and asking a random sample of folks how long they're staying so that we could then mathematically make an estimate of overall visitation. The last California example that I want to talk about is from Torrey Pines. This is a really outstanding example. I would love to be able to credit whoever did this little study, but I'm not entirely sure who it is. But it's really well done, and they've got a nice write-up, which I'm just picking some of the key points from here. And again, here the issue was the need for accurate counts, attendance, and they had to separate between the natural area and the upland and beach use for reporting purposes. They knew they had a lot of unpaid use, and they wanted to be able to estimate how much. So in this case, they used a correlational approach, pretty simple mathematical linear relationship, and they were able to get the paid visitation from the two main parking lots. You can see them there in that Google Earth image. There's one to the north and one to the south. And so they had a good estimate of paid visitation. There's also this lodge. You can see it sort of down in that lower right. And they had some counts from that location as well. They also, I think, they had electronic counters on some of the entrances too. And what they did was they used a probability proportionate to use approach to randomly select 16 days to get count data on site. So folks, volunteers out there counting visitors entering at 3 entrances. And they used a nice sampling approach where they randomly selected 2-hour time blocks and went through sort of an imputational process that was pretty rigorous to estimate total use based on those samples of 2 hours. So they compared those observational daily counts to the data for the same days for paid cars, for the electronic counters, and the counts at the visitor lodge. And they found that interestingly, the electronic counters didn't work well, which is surprising. It might be given the nature of the location where they're placed, that not everybody was captured, or maybe there were multiple folks going in and out or something like that. And they found that using the counts from the lodge didn't help very much. However, they found a really strong relationship between vehicles, paid vehicle use, and the observer counts. And you can see in this graph that's really remarkable there. If you're a stats nerd, their R-square value was 80.80, so 80% of the variation in paid in the relationship here was explained by paid cars. So a very solid relationship that then allows them to estimate overall unpaid visitation. It turns out in this study that they concluded that almost 60% of their visitors were non-paid. So really nice example, 16 days of data collection. They used volunteers to collect the data and had somebody who had enough understanding of the statistics to do the analysis, which you can do in Excel. So yeah, great example. Okay, switching to two other examples that are a little bit different. I mentioned the National Visitor Use Monitoring effort of the Forest Service, which goal is to estimate total visits to the US forests. So a big undertaking for sure. They stratify by 4 types of sites within each forest: developed day use, developed overnight use, wilderness, and then all other general forest. And then they have another view corridor one that's a little bit more, it's rarer for those. And they have 5 use level strata from very high to basically almost none. And each forest classifies all of their X sites into site type and to use level, and they draw random samples to estimate visitation across the region and nationally. So the data are coarse enough that they cannot estimate use at any given site, but it's statistically designed to be able to allow that estimation at a forest level, a regional level, and a national level. If they were trying to go for the site level, it'd be absolutely prohibitively costly. They have 3 different types of surveys that they pair with the observations and the counts. They have a basic one, and then one that focuses on economics and one that focuses on satisfaction. So they do have a way to, for example, they get group size on the survey so that then they can estimate from vehicles to total visitation. They run through 20% of forests per year. This has been going on now for a while because they're into maybe around 3, possibly even now. Forests that are, just to give you a sense of the effort that's required here, each forest is assigned somewhere between about 200 and 300 days on their fieldwork schedule. So in the year that you're up, there's a lot of field data collection. But it does estimate overall system level with a confidence errors on that so that they can track change over time. The last example that I want to talk about is a different one. Sometimes this gets called community science, or at least in this particular effort where they've been piloting, they call it community science. And the idea is using this chat bot at remote trailheads to ask people to report how many cars there are in the parking lot. And this is a fairly new effort, but it seems to have promise for this. In this paper that just came out, they report on using this for 14 trailheads in National Forest in Washington state. So this is just trail use. And the trailheads had a range of use level, parking lot size, cell phone coverage, some did and some didn't, and proximity to towns and cities. And they, because this was a research study, they were looking at actual on-site paired counts and then what they got through the chatbot surveys. So they had infrared counters at some of the trailheads. And they were really pleased with the results. They looked at a couple things. One, what kind of information were people willing to provide? And so between like 1 and 12% of people actually got in and provided information. So fairly low overall participation rate. But for folks who did participate, the percent that answered each of the questions is shown in this table. So you can see, like, for the folks who got on there and entered data, everybody at least counted the cars. But when you started asking about personal information, like what year you were born, like a lot of people didn't answer that. So it seems like a decent way to get car counts. Looks like a lot of people reported the time and some of the other data that could be useful too. The interesting thing is they found that the chatbot data here on the y-axis, or sorry, I guess I have that actually labeled backwards. The volunteer counts on the y-axis, and then, oh yeah, that's correct. The chatbot's volunteered, and then the validation counts on the x-axis, and that is an amazingly tight distribution, almost perfect. So when people were reporting on visitation, they were highly accurate. So this might be an interesting way to get a lot of data. The data that are provided, at least from this initial effort, are pretty good quality and good quality across 3 different locations there. So something to potentially think about. And I just wanted to put a shout out. Ashley's got a project going on right now using this technology in a mountain biking area, so a little different type of user group, and she might be willing to talk about how that's going during our Q&A session. Okay, so those were the examples, just a few things on data analysis and management. It's important to have a data management plan and to think about that in advance. Know how you're going to use the data, know how you're going to analyze the data so that it can give you what you need. If you do, for example, get parking lot capacity data, but you don't get a turnover rate, then you can't use the data for estimating total visitation, at least not as validly as you might want to. Sometimes the effort is really getting out there on site. So if you know that having some additional type of data would help you, thinking that through in advance can really improve the quality and utility of the data. Additionally, thinking about combining data types, if you do have multiple sources of data, just being careful about how you approach that. One example of that, I have done a project here with the National Forest that have the use limits in the Cascades, and part of our monitoring that led up to those use limits was tracking visitor encounters in the wilderness. And we had ranger collected data, and rangers, you can imagine, are going to places that are heavily visited. Their days are longer. You know, they go to those popular sites. So we had a lot of data from the rangers. We also had a fleet of volunteers who collected a lot of data for us over a few years. I mean, who wouldn't love to go out in the wilderness and walk around and just count people? I mean, they love it. They get a free wilderness pass for doing it. But volunteers travel a little bit more like normal regular visitors than rangers. And so we knew ahead of time that we needed to keep those 2 data sources separate to then see, okay, are they telling us the same thing? That increases our confidence in our conclusions. Are they telling us something different, and why might that be? So just being careful. This could be, this relates also to things like surveys. If you are collecting survey data using a representative sample, say on site, and then a freely available web survey, you probably want to keep those separate to make sure that you can compare whether they are telling you the same thing. Analysis for a lot of these data can be pretty straightforward. If you have basic Excel skills, you can do a lot of the work in Excel. You can do more if you use R or a package like SPSS, but a lot can be done in Excel. And if you're using counters, the software does come in with some pre-packaged kinds of options, like these ones from Trafix. These are just some data from our trail counter on one of the trails at Big Basin this summer, and this automatically generates for us what our weekly total number of counts on that counter. The last thing I want to touch on really quickly is opportunities for using volunteers and partners. Attendance data are a great place to use volunteers and partners. We talked about last time that distributing surveys takes a little higher level of interpersonal skill and that willingness to approach people and talk with them. If you're just observing and counting people, the work is fairly straightforward, can be done really reliably. It does require training, but not a ton. And we've got collectively a lot of experience. We use student interns at Big Basin. I mean, they weren't volunteers, but they were partners from West Valley College. Ashley's worked with Conservation Corps. I've worked with NGOs, the Great Old Broads for Wilderness and Friends of Central Cascades Wilderness, have done a lot of work, and they often really enjoy it. They do really high quality work. Yeah, so good way to generate data. We've used them for calibrating counters, for doing that encounter monitoring, for doing some of the counts. So a lot of these types of attendance data are suitable for volunteers and partners. And then Ashley also has worked in some cases where they've got volunteers who tend to be highly educated and like to play with data, who've actually been doing some of the data analysis for them, which is really nice if you don't have that capacity in-house. So some of the larger friends groups, if you've got good relationships with them, not everyone in that organization has the interest and skill, but often there's somebody there who just, they like to have a little passion project and they can work, that can work out really well in the long run. Okay, so our take-home messages from this session, that attendance data can serve many purposes, but not every issue does require having attendance data. Many methods are available, so knowing what you want to use the data for and choosing the appropriate methods, there's trade-offs in terms of accuracy and cost and quality of the data. You just simply need to think through those to get the best option for your particular location. And when you're designing monitoring, consider what kind of sampling you want to use, consider how you're going to analyze the data, and then think about whether there's an opportunity to leverage partnerships or volunteers to help you with that effort. And with that, we have plenty of time for discussion and questions.